Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark McNacken. My co-host Rob Brandt and I are joined today by Dan Adams, head of the Bank of Montreal Office of Reconciliation. BMO is Canada's oldest bank and one that has been banking Indigenous communities since 1992. Dan has spent his career turning Indigenous finance into commercial reality. Under his leadership, BMO's Indigenous portfolio has grown by over 400%, with assets under administration now exceeding 20 billion Canadian dollars, and the bank has issued Canada's first ever Indigenous bond. In today's conversation, you'll learn why Dan believes capital markets are the next frontier for Indigenous equity participation in major Canadian projects, what the shift from consultation to ownership means for project finance, and what foreign investors need to understand about trust, relationships, and due diligence before deploying capital into the space. Welcome, Dan Adams, head of Bank of Montreal, BMO's Office of Reconciliation. Pleasure to have you with us here today, Dan.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. Ani Buju Dan Adams Niknataz and Mki Wikadong Nindanuji. So that meant hello, greetings. My name is Dan Adams, and I'm coming from Thunder Bay, Ontario.
Well, thanks. Hi, Dan. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your personal story and where you grew up and how you ended up at BMO and in financial services generally, I guess, many years ago.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess it is personal to me, and it is where I grew up and where my family is and where I live. So I grew up in really small communities in the north. Every community was under 1,000 people. In Canada's north, Indigenous peoples are not the minority, but in fact, we really didn't think of it that way. We're just friends and neighbors and family. I married an Indigenous woman, so our children are members of Saikeen First Nation, where their grandfather was born, and that's in Treaty 1, just north of Winnipeg. When I became a commercial banker for BMO in 2010, I had some First Nations in my portfolio, and to be honest with you, I just enjoyed working with them more than my other customers. So I naturally just grew that side of the portfolio to one of the largest in Canada. In 2016, I was promoted to vice president of the Indigenous banking unit, and I absolutely loved it. I was in communities most of the time, working with councils, administration. We built infrastructure, housing, economic development. We even banked ice roads. It was a lot of fun, and it was full of purpose.
Wow. Why don't you talk a little bit about ice roads? Because for our listeners and viewers over here in the UK, when there's a few snowflakes, everything shuts down, and you're talking about ice roads. So yeah, share them the joys of living in the north.
So in Northern Ontario, especially in the further north you go in Ontario and many other parts in Northern Canada as well, a lot of the First Nation communities and Indigenous governments are located where there isn't all-season roads. So for the most part, it's fly-in only. And for a couple short months, and that window is getting smaller and smaller every year, they build an ice road. So what that ice road really means is just it's over the snow. It's when lakes and muskeg and everything freezes, they're able to put a road on it. And it's during that small window where most of everything has to be transported up to that community. And anything large, for it could be fuel for power, but also any building material, for houses or anything like that, usually comes up on the winter ice roads, ready to be built during that next summer season.
And you said the season is shortening, and those are vital lifelines, but at least the Ontario government has, and in the far north too, there's plans to build all-season roads through some pretty remote communities.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes industry builds some roads that could be connected to a community. It could be, a mine, it could be forestry, it could be, something like that. But a lot of the communities, especially where I am, looking to Northern Ontario, and we call that Treaty 9 or NAN communities, most of them are still fly-in only. There's some great air companies that service that. One of our customers is Wasaya Airways. They do a great job, as well as some others one as well. And it's really a lifeline to those communities and that's the only place they could, like I said, bring up food or sometimes even fuel for power and electricity.
Yes, and thank you for that. And maybe just for context, and I should have asked this earlier, how far from Toronto is Thunder Bay by plane?
So, well, by plane, it's not too bad. It's only a couple hours. And there's several flights a day. So it is an easy commute to Toronto, and I go there often. However, to drive it would probably be about 16 hours of straight driving. So usually a couple days. And some of the communities I was telling you about, that's still another between, say, 400 and 1,200 kilometers north of Thunder Bay even. So Ontario is a big place, and Canada is a big place, and again, it's not even just Northern Ontario. It's much of Canada's north.
Yes. So thank you for that context, because when we drive up here to Scotland, and it's a 5-hour, 6-hour drive, we're going to the north. So just so our listeners understand the scale of it. But let's come back to what you've been doing. So BMO announced the creation of the Office of Reconciliation in June 2025. It was a step up from unit level banking to enterprise-wide mandate. Can you talk about that structural shift and what it means in practice, and why BMO decided the moment was right to do this? Because you've been part of this journey the whole way.
Yeah, I have. And we're proud of the creation of the Office of Reconciliation in 2025. Though the milestone was years in the making, Mark, our journey began much earlier when we established BMO's Indigenous banking, and that was 1992. And that was the first of its kind in Canada, and that was with Ron Jameson. Through deep engagement with Indigenous clients and communities, and by learning through really immersion into that culture, we came to recognize both clients and communities and the responsibility of the broader need for all of society, and definitely including us, is we need to learn, we need to evolve, we need to reconcile. This work compelled us to confront and remove a lot of policies that we've had that was rooted in systemic discrimination. And we needed to replace them with approaches that was grounded in knowledge, respect, and inclusion. Examples would include recognizing First Nations as governments and providing 100% financing for community infrastructure without requiring any physical security, which is really circumventing Section 89 of the Indian Act. But I always look back to really, the most groundbreaking work was done by the Center of Truth and Reconciliation and that commission, and the work that they did between 2008 and 2015. And what they gifted Canada in 2015 was the 94 calls to action. That was really a national roadmap that opened the hearts and the minds across the country, again, including BMO with over 40,000 employees just in Canada. Since then, our efforts have accelerated, beginning with a lot of internal education and expanding into more inclusive policies and financial products and programs. In 2019, we launched the Indigenous Personal Banking Program, which is essentially free banking for all Indigenous people for a year. In 2020, we established our Indigenous Advisory Council, and then we've even created an Indigenous virtual banking group. And what that does is it overcomes the geographic barriers that we're just talking about, the huge geography in Canada, right? If you look at all the maps.
Can't really say, come and see us at the branch, right?
Yeah, it's true. If you look at the map of Canada, and where not just BMO branches are, where like all bank branches are, the true access to banking, they're around populated areas, and that makes sense. You need enough customers, you need enough employees, to make a branch viable. But then if you overlay that map of where the First Nations are located in Canada, they're often not in the same place, and often a lot of the First Nations that are again in north or just more at a distance, from branch networks. So what our virtual banking group has done is they're able to service all of our Indigenous customers no matter the geography, and that includes opening up bank accounts. Before, we would have customers, say, in Attawapiskat or Sheshawan, they would have spent thousands of dollars to fly to Timmins to open up a bank account. And that wasn't right. And we needed to be better on that. So we're quite, proud that we created this to provide more access to banking. We also created the first Indigenous entrepreneur program. And what that is we could service all Indigenous entrepreneurs, no matter where they live. Whether it's on or off reserve, we're not going to ask for physical security, which again, circumvents 89 of the Indian Act. Yeah. And, and we just created, the first ever Indigenous bond as well too, plus many other initiatives. So saying that reconciliation has always been part of our work, and we have been doing some good work there. But to be honest, much of that was carried out on the sides of our desks. And for several years now, we talked about, what if we had a dedicated team? How much more could we do? How much more work could we accomplish? So I am proud of this investment that we made. We're fully committed. We're all in to advancing reconciliation, but now it's in a real deliberate and consultative and meaningful way.
Yeah, and that's an impressive record of a lot of firsts in the Indigenous financial services world, starting with the legendary Ron Jameson.
Yeah.
Who's well known in Canadian Indigenous and banking circles. So he was BMO and focused on Indigenous communities, helping bank them. And right up to the most recent bond that was issued. We want to talk a little bit more about each of those things, but it's great to see the evolution of the services that BMO has provided. And you talk about what has changed in Canada over, say, just the last 10 years. And we get that question, especially from foreign investors. What's different about Canada? One of the things that's different is the financial tools that are now available to assist in economic development in Indigenous communities. So that bond you mentioned was very cool. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So the bond's interesting, and it's a little bit different than, what a traditional sense of a purpose of a bond. So often, bonds are created to raise money, through that debt instrument. And once that pool of money is raised, then it could be, put out into the market. So our bond is a little bit different, where it's from already our existing portfolio. And a lot of this conversation came from, years in the making, where we would have it, with our peers in the investment world, whether it's, it's a pension plan or just anywhere else in corporate Canada. When we're talking about our reconciliation journey, sometimes they would say, yeah, but you're a bank. You're able to provide a loan to a First Nation so they could build a house, or you're able to to invest directly into that economic development corporation that's owned by an Indigenous government. And then they would say, that's not our line of business, so we can't participate in that economic reconciliation. So through lots of different conversations, and just through our own track record of creating sustainable bonds, and through that framework, we thought, well, what if we were to have an Indigenous bond? What if and that would be available to all investors, to say that this is an opportunity that you as well could participate in economic reconciliation. And we're just fortunate and grateful that we do have a long track record of having some great customers who trusted us to finance community infrastructure, economic development, and all those great things. So we carefully packaged up some of that term debt, and we were quite curious to see what the market would be like. And as we thought, it was received really well, and institutional investors purchased it almost immediately. So that's something that we would like to continue doing, and we hope others will do as well.
And how will that money be deployed then from
Yeah, so like I said, it's already basically have been deployed, right? So that money, that those term loans are already in community, and it's already built houses and used for operating, for own source revenue and in community infrastructure and economic development and things like that. So the track record was already there, and the purpose was already met. And it was just, and again, an opportunity for others to participate in some of that debt and those loans.
With that, did you have also international institutions participate, or it was just in the Canadian domestic market?
Yeah, our capital markets folks would probably know the answer to that more than I would. However, I believe that it was purchased so quickly and it was all Canadian investors.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
closest to the market, that's what happens when you understand the market
Yeah.
you're in, and something like that comes out. So
Like I said,
that
I
is
hope there'll be
an
more.
important step.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sounds like
Yeah.
there may be more
More.
coming. Yeah, more
Yeah.
opportunities.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that was one of the initiatives that you've talked about in terms of, enterprise-wide across BMO. When you're walking in a business line in your new role that has historically had little direct Indigenous engagement, how do you make the case to them? How do they understand, besides it's a corporate mandate and we're doing this?
Yeah.
How do you bring them along? Because you have a great personal background to be able to understand both perspectives.
Right. And I guess that's true for a lot of the folks that work within BMO's Indigenous banking unit. I mean, we're all commercial bankers by background, and we've all, been doing it, the groundwork, so to speak, in communities and so on. When we get promoted to other positions, we're able to try to bring in more support and more commitment from the broader enterprise. But as I mentioned before, is really the Indigenous banking unit. I mean, and we talked about Ron Jameson, Rob. He started 34 years ago. And when Ron started, and this is Ron's story, and I love telling it because he told me so many times. When he first started, he would basically just ask questions. He would say, well, why are you doing it this way? Why are you doing it that way? And how Ron tells the story is he would get the same answers back as like, well, Ron, we're a bank. That's how we do things. And then Ron would say, well, don't you know how it works? Right. And then Ron would start educating. Right. And that was really the 34 years ago is when we started our journey of knowledge and learning really how things worked. And when you think of like Indigenous people across Canada, just like Ron, that's always been leaders in business, governments, and within their own communities. And within our own employees, our Indigenous employees, our customers and partners, they're highly capable and forward thinking, and they're all very deeply entrepreneurial, which has always been helpful. And Canada is strongest when Indigenous knowledge, leadership, and full participation are fully engaged. Over the last 5 years, BMO's Indigenous portfolio grew over 400%, reflecting both the momentum, but also within Indigenous communities, but also within the trust, that we were able to build in the longstanding relationships. Indigenous peoples represent the fastest growing demographic in Canada and some of the most educated as well. So global, when we look at markets, I think they are taking notice as Indigenous communities, especially now, they're starting to assert their legal and their treaty and their territorial rights. Doing so through these approaches, especially when they're grounded in relationships and environmental stewardship as well too. They are stewards of the land, and also social development. It makes the whole country a better place. These principles are not only values-based, but they create sustainable long-term economic growth that benefits communities, partners, but the overall broader economy.
And I think this story you've shared with us when Ron started out this process, and I think this is what international investors are seeing. This isn't new. It's been under the surface, and it's been a long, hard journey, as it always has been, unfortunately, for the Indigenous people in Canada, but is now coming out to fruition, where all of a sudden you have this base of knowledge, you have some very successful entrepreneurs, we've talked about some of the most successful entrepreneurs in Canada today are Indigenous because they've always had the system against them. So that's kind of changed around. So I think that was interesting background.
One other thing on that too, Mark, is it has been, it has really been decades in the making. You're correct on that. But I feel that we're growing together in many ways where the nations themselves, they were creating capacity and they were, changing even the mindsets within their own community about, growing businesses and own source revenue in and out of even their traditional territory sometimes, right?
Yes.
A good business is a good business, no matter where it is. At the same time, we were fine-tuning our own policy, and we were getting better too, and we were learning ourselves. And I always look to our customer as saying, it's like, every year, I think they look to us and all the banks really is to be better. And that always gave us the motivation. It's like, okay, we did good work last year, but we got to keep going. There's more to be done, and we got to get better. We need better policies. We need better products. And every year, I think we do a lot of that, but there's still a long ways to go.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what's next, Dan, for BMO. It's obviously talked a lot about doing the right thing for Indigenous communities and how to assist, but it's pretty clear it's been good for business too for BMO. You wouldn't see those tools that you've helped develop over the years if it didn't make good business sense for the bank.
Absolutely, it is great business, and it's sometimes you see being mentioned at the same time as like DE&I. It's not at all. I mean, it's good business. They're amazing customers, great track record of loyal, long-lasting relationships on both sides. And I just look at some of the other lines of business that might not have the tenure. As if you look at, say, personal banking or commercial banking has always been like, the main relationship of the Indigenous government, right? And then the personal banking was always taking care of the individuals, the members, no matter where they live across Canada. But now you see, capital markets, you see investment banking, you see wealth. So that's really interesting because they might not have that tenure. However, the way that BMO has always operated is that we have always looked at everything as it's one bank, one client. So we're able to take that track record that we have in other lines of business, and it really transcends right across the whole enterprise. That it is, valuable business. It's good. Like, we love our customers, as well as lots of growth potential as well too. So the Indigenous Bank Unit and the Office of Reconciliation is right across the whole enterprise of BMO. It's not just.
That's what I was just going to ask that. Yeah. Are you into the investment banking, wealth management, asset management across the bank? Is your group involved in some way in assisting some of those initiatives?
Yeah, we really are. And it's not to say that, we go into capital markets and we tell them how to structure a deal. But what we do is we provide education. And we help them to understand how to have a long-lasting relationship built on trust. And you got to earn that trust, and you got to go in community. And sometimes it takes time, but it's worth it. And you have to do things right and properly and respectfully, and that doesn't matter what line of business you're in, whether it's commercial banking, corporate finance, capital markets, wealth. It really doesn't matter. Relationships are the cornerstone of that.
We're seeing now also Indigenous nations moving from being consulted to having equity stakes. And what are you seeing now in terms of institutional financing infrastructure to enable that? And how far along is Canada in building it? So if outside investors looking at Canada and thinking, should I be working at this now, or do I wait a bit more? Or,
well, I know investors look for growth and they look for value, right? So I did mention that our portfolio grew about 400% just in a handful of years. I don't know if there's any other part of the bank that could say the same. And including assets under administration, our balances now exceed over $20 billion. So to me, that's clear evidence of both scale and the speed of progress among among our customers. So 15 years ago, if you look at what we would normally provide service for an Indigenous government customer, is it was largely based on bridging government funding to meet basic operating needs. Sometimes it was just meeting a payroll or to build a modest level amount of houses or maybe a community center. That reality has changed profoundly. Today, our customers are generating meaningful own source revenue, offsetting what I would say the chronic government underfunding, and investing in economic development, both within and beyond their community and their traditional territory. Their needs have evolved accordingly. So many years ago too, it was often just loans, right? And so I would say from primarily borrowing, they're seeking sophisticated wealth management now, and it's long-term planning and capital preservation strategies. This evolution is also a tangible expression, I believe, of reconciliation. Economic participation in financial self-determination and access to the full spectrum of financial tools are fundamental to rebuilding that prosperity and correcting really a lot of historical inequities. So supporting Indigenous governments and enterprises as they transition from fiscal constraint to economic leadership, sometimes in the whole region, is not only good for banking, but it's central to advancing reconciliation through sustained and measurable outcomes. I think you mentioned like capital markets, and I find that really interesting because I believe that capital markets are probably the next phase of the journey, and that will be the next evolution of Indigenous participation in the major projects. So bank capital market teams could play a critical role in actually, offering a financing for a transaction, right? But then you could also have financial equity positions on either side of that transaction, and those are both needed. Whether it's First Nation, participation in some sort of equity, but also on the industry side too. So both sides of the equation needs financing. And then I think what we could do a little bit more of is traditional, but also innovative capital raising structures as well too. And even more so than that is advisory, right? We got to together on, as a relationship, you have to navigate some pretty complex transactions, but also some regulatory frameworks and now government guarantees as well. So in this space, reconciliation, I believe, is built on trust, consistency, and it's that partnership, ensuring Indigenous participation is not symbolic. It's more substantive and enduring that value creating. So it always comes down to, I believe, that trusted relationships will really be the success and moving forward for the next chapter.
Yeah, right on, Dan. Yeah, and you've got so much experience banking Indigenous projects and communities, living in the communities yourself. What advice would you have for foreign investors in particular who are looking at Canadian projects involving Indigenous people and needing to understand what, not knowing what they don't know, I guess? Any top tips?
Sure. Yeah, there are a few. When I think of if I were to say just a few different things, first, for an investor, I would say that make sure the Indigenous government supports the project through and through. And that consultative process is done in a respectful and fulsome way with community engagement, just to ensure that all that regulatory, the environmental, the compliance, UNDRIP, EPIC, everything that has been satisfied. The second thing I would say is make sure the project makes sense long term, extending beyond those current political cycles. both, locally, but also federally as well too, and earning the support of local residents for generations to come. Because all of these projects are for many, many generations, right? And yeah, it could make sense now, but will it make sense in 20 years? Just to make sure the community is actually supportive of that as well. And finally, going back to relationships matter. So Indigenous partnerships are not a box checking exercise. They require time and they require trust, and you have to earn that to be successful.
Great lessons. And, coming back to that relationships, when we go back and look at ourselves or talk to our parents and grandparents, business used to be done based on relationships.
Yeah.
So you're kind of coming back, and the Indigenous people talk very much about relationships, whereas the non-Indigenous have had to suffer. Relationships don't count anymore. It's a transaction. Here's a price. Do you want it or not? Indigenous are coming and saying, rightfully, as rights holders, hey, we're going to work on this together, because if you don't start with us, you're going to end up with us at the end of the process. And if you wasted all that time, we're just going to start from zero whenever you get to us. So it's important to have those early conversations.
Yeah.
To just introduce yourself and your project and what you're trying to achieve, and get the input from the Indigenous people. They want to have the opportunity as much as anyone. And now that they're rights holders, it's no longer clear, oh, do we just have to ask them, what can we do? It's no, they've got a seat at the table, right? So treat them as the partners they are, that have been reinforced by the Supreme Court and the Constitution and the attitude now of the progressive organizations, the banks, BMO. Nobody's going to be able to go and say they weren't told. Oh, that's a surprise. I didn't know I needed to do that. Right.
The duty to consult. I mean, that's not new. That was part of Section 35, and going back into the 1980s. And that really is a government duty, but historically that was delegated, from government to industry, and that wasn't always done in a good way, right? A lot of times it was just industry informing of the decisions and then saying, well, I told them and consulted, and it wasn't done in a meaningful way. And now, nations have that opportunity to shape, the project, and to be on the, not the decisioning, but to be an owner. And being on the owner's table of that is absolutely huge, and it's needed. So I look at, like, today, the model is changing in a fundamental way. The Indigenous governments have really moved beyond the consultation part of it to the ownership and governance of projects. Equity participation, I think, not only aligns the interest, but it also ensures long-term community benefit and accountability. So I think industry has come a long way as well too, not only with government, and especially accepting the legislation of UNDRIP certainly will help and will mandate some of these things. But I think of also even public policy. So public policy has been a critical enabler of that shift. One great example, and I'm sure they won't mind me saying it, is Ontario Hydro One. So they now actually have a framework, and within policy for all new transmission lines, there is Indigenous ownership. So they're normalizing it, and it's now becoming a part of ownership of major infrastructure development. And I think that's great. Government guarantees have also going to play will play an important role. There's a couple under their belt right now, which is good. But particularly with projects with some construction risk as well too. So that's going to play an important role for banks to look at, whether or not you finance these. They always look at risk, do their due diligence, and with that comes from, well, what if there is a hiccup? Where's the recourse, right? And many of these projects now, they're in hundreds of millions of dollars, and it could involve, a small community. And that is now out of scope, of what they're able to provide, some sort of recourse. So that government guarantee actually makes that recourse, makes a financer look at the actual merits of that project itself, And instead of looking at a small community saying, well, what other revenue, could you use? That revenue really should be for the community. It should be for social services, for infrastructure, for economic development, not so much for recourse because, their land is being impacted in their traditional and within their traditional territory. So that guarantee is going to be big. And I think just Canadian banks in general remain eager in supporting it, and there is a growing sentiment of the alignment within different governments as well, being both federal and provincial.
Yeah, so many great things going on, Dan, and you've got a unique position in Thunder Bay, unique view into the north, not just northern Ontario, but northern Canada and the far north. Are you seeing an uptick in interest? Certainly an uptick in activity, and Indigenous communities are at the center of it all in the north.
Yeah, 100%. And it's well diversified. So it's energy, it's mining, it's forestry, and then also too, a lot of the First Nations, no matter where they're geographically located, they're part of the urban infrastructure as well too, like within the cities, whether it's it's Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, Sudbury, Winnipeg. Many of those communities now that they have their offices located in the city. Many of their members live in the city, so they're investing in housing and businesses and economic opportunities all over the place, which is really great to see.
Yes, it is, and we're very pleased that we have one of your colleagues from BMO will be joining us in London this year at the summit coming up on April 7th in the Square Mile, which is very good. But I know every June you have an annual report, your Indigenous Partnerships and Progress report. Can you just talk a little bit about that so our audience will remember to pick it up, and we'll probably highlight it when it comes out?
So it's this one right here. Every year, we create an Indigenous Partnership and Progress report. We try to make it as transparent as possible. We actually even put our portfolio numbers on there as well. But it's really an opportunity to provide an update of what we've been doing the last few years, the last 12 months. And within that report, we give the opportunity for our customers to tell their stories. And that's always my favorite part.
Great. Well, I look forward to reading that when it comes out.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say thank you for that. You're keeping the conversation going. You're making the conversation mainstream. And I always say, we should be normalizing this. This shouldn't be a specialization of banking. Everyone should have this knowledge and this education. So we're within the Office of Reconciliation. We're all in on education. We're doing a lot of different things because knowledge does matter, and it does help inform policies and practices. So thanks for conversation. Thanks for inviting me.
Well,
thanks again for the time, Dan, and running through so many interesting initiatives that you've been involved with, helped lead, and sounds like you're going to continue to lead for some time to come. Well done.
Yes. Much appreciated. Well done. Thank you.
Okay.
Yawa.
Thank you to Dan Adams for sharing his insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 summit taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.